Hey, welcome back. In today's tutorial, I want to teach you one of the most important concepts in writing realistic and powerful music, which is using performance controls. Specifically, I'm talking about automation, velocity, expression, and modulation. Very surprisingly, I have seen many composers and producers overlook this very useful technique. Let me quickly explain the difference between modulation and expression. Modulation is adding realism and movement to your instruments. Basically how a real violinist, for example, would play their instrument with emotion and using subtle movements for realism. And expression is basically just the volume control without changing the timbre of that instrument. These tools are essential when writing cinematic music, trailer, orchestral, or hybrid music. They help bring your track to life by adding realism and make your instrument feel like they're being performed by a real musician instead of just triggered samples. Alright, let's dive right in. Alright, before we start applying any performance controls, I went ahead and create a short, simple, fantasy type cinematic mockup. But first, let me show you the sample libraries that I'm using for this tutorial. For female vocals, I'm using Ethereal Gold by Zero G. For the strings section, I'm using Cinematic Studio Strings using the Sustain Ensemble patch. And then for the brass section, I'm using French horns and low brass. And I'm using Talos by Audio Imperia. And then for drums and percussion loop, I'm using Cerberus by Audio Imperia. And I just went through the library and I found this really great loop that fit well with this orchestral mockup that I created. And then for the drum hits, I used Ferrum by Keep Forest. I ended up using the patch called Epic Trailer Percussion. Now, since this tutorial is all about automating your instruments to add realism, I'm going to go through each instrument one by one and apply velocity, modulation, expression, and on some value automation so you can see my exact approach. But first, let's listen to the full track with none of these techniques applied. So at this stage, the track sounds solid, but stay until the end of the tutorial because once we apply the modulation, the expression, and velocity, you'll clearly hear how these performance controls brings the music to life and making it feel far more realistic. Alright, now that you've heard the track with no modulation applied, let's go ahead and start with the vocals. Let's go ahead to the MIDI vocal section here and double click on it. As you can see, after I double click the MIDI track region, you can see the piano roll appear at the bottom of the screen. This is where I do all my MIDI editing and audio editing. Here's a quick tip. You can also hold down Option on Mac and double click on the MIDI region and it enlarges the piano grid roll where you can also do the editing there as well. It's all about preference. But anyway, the first thing I want to work with, like I said, is the vocals. For Ethereal Gold, we're going to play around with the velocity, which actually controls the vibrato effect. It also changes up the style of the sample just subtly. It really depends how drastically you adjust the velocity levels. So I'm going to loop this section for the vocals and start adjusting the velocity of each note until it feels more natural and expressive. I like that last note better. It's a little bit more expressive and powerful. Okay, so now let's move on to the string section so we can give them more movement to make them feel more alive. But first, I want to give you another quick tip to add realism. I'm going to go ahead and double click on this MIDI region of the piano. And if you look down here on the piano roll grid, you'll notice that after each chord, there's a gap. This whole MIDI chord progression has gaps right after the chord ends. This is obviously intentional. I do this because real string players need time to breathe when they're playing their instrument. For example, if a violinist, he or she, when she plays, she breathes and she takes time to go from one string or chord to another. By adding these gaps, it mimics that. It mimics that realism. Throughout the years of experience, I noticed by adding these small gaps to brass, strings, and all kinds of orchestral elements, it really gives that human feel of a performance. So when I wrote this chord progression for the string section, I really liked how it came out as far as velocities, but I'm going to go ahead and play it again in a loop, and let's see if we can adjust maybe the lower register of these strings. So I think I'm going to make that last chord just hit a little bit harder. G, and then we got our G up here, so let's bring this G up a little bit more. Let's make this one hit about 85, 86, around there. Now let's play it again and see what that sounds like. So I'm actually going to bring these a little bit closer to the grid right here, because they did come in a little early. That right there, see what that sounds like. Excellent. Okay. Now let's move on to our modulation. All right. Let's hit A. Let's pick our modulation. Let's start modulating, right? See what this sounds like real quick. Down here, let's around 76, 80. And I'm going to zoom in a little closer. This could be tedious, but believe me, it's well worth it. Let me see how that sounds like. I'm going to start that a little bit lower. So Option and then down arrow. See what that sounds like. Yeah, that sounds really cool. I like that. Let's start there. Bring it here. Oh, and real quick, the reason why I like drawing with the pencil is, again, all these little note variations you hear for this modulation really brings out the timbre and articulations to mimic how a real string player would play it. Because I have seen some composers just do something like this, right? Where it's just a straight line, which is okay, but it doesn't really give it much articulation or a timbre sound. And I prefer using this method because drawing it with the pencil just makes it seem more alive, more real. And again, that's just the way I do it. You know, if you want to use a straight line and, you know, it sounds great, go for it. But this just works for me. Let's try there a little bit on here. Let's just do quick ones, and then we're going to go back and adjust them, fine-tuning them. Does it look? Is it raising up? Let's bring these down a bit. And another cool trick you can do, you can obviously highlight Command C, put your precision here, and Command V. That's another way to do it, you know, which is a lot faster. But, you know, sometimes I like just drawing it because each chord is different and it requires different types of modulation and expression articulation. So yeah, you can do it this way too. And plus, doing it this way, it gives each chord a very different type of expression and modulation. As opposed to copying and pasting, you'll get the same modulation, same expression for each chord. See how we're doing here. Okay, cool. It's looking okay. Here's another cool quick tip. Your last chord at the end of your track, you want to make it very powerful as it's rising. So I tend to start with a very low modulation and expression edit point and just rise it all the way up, just like that. Okay, so now let's just hit play and let's go fine tune our edit points for our modulation. Nice. Now let's go ahead and do our expression. And again, like I mentioned earlier, there's nothing wrong with copying and pasting the modulation and expression edit points. Sometimes you have a client who's, you know, giving you a really tight deadline, and that's a really good option to use, you know. But for me, I prefer drawing in the edit points with the pencil tool. Okay, let's listen back to the expression and see what we can fine tune. that a little bit more dramatic. Nice. Okay, up next are the French horns. I'll start by adjusting the velocity until I'm happy with the brightness and attack of it. So again, let's go ahead and double click on it. Here we have our piano roll grid. So let's go ahead and loop it, listen to it, and see what we can do as far as adjusting the velocity. And actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to enable the strings too, because I want to compare the brass to how it fits well with the strings. It's always a good practice whenever you're adjusting velocity expression to always compare it to another main instrument so you know how well it sits. Or you can wait till the very end when you're mixing. So it's up to you, it's preference. But in this case, I'm going to enable the strings so I can hear how the velocity sounds along with the strings. I already know I want to increase the velocity on these last three notes just a bit more because it is towards the end and it needs to be a little bit more powerful. All right, I really like it. Let's go on and do our modulation and expression. There you are. Nope. I want to do modulation first. Modulation. Okay, let me zoom in a bit. Get our pencil tool. And let's start here. Here and here. Let me just hear what that sounds like. And I'm going to disable the strings just for this part. Actually, let me enable the strings again real quick. I'm going to bring them up just a little bit. So I'll hit Option and tap the up arrow. See what that sounds like. Much better. So we're going to stick to the range with the low being 70 for modulation, the high around 90. So let's just stick to that. And again, when I say stick around to that, just, averagely stick around to that. It's okay if you go lower than that or higher, because we're going to go back and adjust it and tweak the edit points for the modulation and expression anyway. So. And if you notice how I add my curve like right here, right before the note ends, as opposed to, doing it up here and then dipping down, it's because it sounds too unrealistic if I do it this way. And it also depends on the library you're using. So for this brass sample library, it works best when I do my curves around here and then dip them down and have it start later in the next note. Let me see how we're doing so far as levels. Yeah, cool. It's got a little bit of variation, but you know what? Let's raise these guys just a little bit. Option up arrow. Right there. Okay. Cool. And let's keep going. Let's get this one here. Little one there. A little skadoosh right there. All right. See what that sounds like. Let me start it here. Nice, I like that a lot. Let's go ahead and do our expression. So I'm gonna start off here. Well, you know what? Yeah, that'll make it louder, right? So let's just start it here and then we'll adjust it later. Let's cross it right there just to give it a little different variation right there. Might be too loud, but we can also automate that with our volume. But let's try that out. Just see what that sounds like with the strings and with the vocals real quick. All right, that sounds a lot better. All right, so for the low brass, I'm going to use that technique we talked about earlier where it copy and paste. I'm going to copy the modulation from the French horns and I'm going to copy the expression from the French horns. Then I'm going to paste them on the low brass, but then I'm going to go back and just tweak them a little to give them a different variation. So it's not exactly the same way the French horns are being played. So let's double click on French horns. Let's start with our modulation. You want to make sure you place your player head right at the beginning. You select all your modulation points. Command C. You go down to brass French horn. You select modulation and Command V. Now let's go back to French horn. Select our expression, which is right here. Select your edit points. Command copy. Go down here to your low brass. Select your expression. Put your header point at the beginning and Command V. So now I'm just going to loop it, just the brass, and I'm going to solo them. Zoom in a little bit. Let's start with our modulation here, and let's hit play. go to our expression. All right, that sounds pretty cool. Now, I know in this tutorial I've been starting with the velocity, but I wanted to get the modulation expression out the way for the brass. So let's go now into the low brass and mess around with our velocity. And I will use the technique where I will solo the low brass, the French horns, and the strings. Make sure we highlight our low brass and hit play. Nice. Let's hear it one more time. Mwah, beautiful. I really loved how the brass instruments came out. They sound more realistic. Just by adding the modulation and the expression and messing around with the velocity, it just brings it to life. It makes it seem like an actual player is actually playing these instruments. All right, finally, let's look at the drums from Ferrum, the hits specifically. So for this library, adjusting velocity changes the impact and intensity, which in turn can either make it very subtle or very epic and powerful. Let me go ahead and pull up Ferrum and press some of the keys so you can hear the velocity changes. I'll start hitting the key subtle and then just harder and harder so you can hear the velocity changes. So as I recorded the hits for this track while I was building the cinematic track, I really love the velocity settings, the way they came out. But let me play the hit section for you and watch the different velocity colors and what those sounds make. And if you don't know, the lighter the color, the less harder the hit is. The darker the color, especially if it's red, the harder it hits. Check it out. And actually, let me adjust these last few notes here. I want to make them a lot harder since it's a climax, it's a crescendo, so I want them to hit harder. Go ahead and click on it, hit A. And what I'm going to do is bring my pencil tool here and drag it here so it crescendos into red. All right. Let's see what that sounds like real quick. Nice. Awesome. So now let's listen to the track again, this time with all the performance controls applied. The modulation, the expression, the velocity changes, and overall all the automation that we apply to all these tracks. Huge difference. The vocals feel expressive, strings and brass sound real, and they're breathing. Drums and percussion, they feel alive. And applying these techniques with the expression, the modulation, the velocity changes, volume automation, it just makes everything work, and it makes all the instruments that much more cohesive. All right, so as you can see, automating your tracks really isn't that complicated, but it makes a massive difference. I highly recommend using these techniques, especially when writing cinematic music, trailer music, or any genre that relies on your track sounding live performed. And if you never applied these techniques to your workflow before, start doing so right away. Like I said before, it will help your instrument give it that realism that live musicians sound like when they're doing live performances. All right, thanks so much for watching. If you found this tutorial helpful in any way, make sure you hit that like and subscribe button. If you have any questions, drop them in the comments and I'd be more than happy to help. Thanks again. I'll see you in the next one.